Hello once again, it's Matthew here from MatthewNorthMusic, and as ever, if you find this video interesting or any topics that I cover on this channel, please think about subscribing to the channel. It's completely free. You just hit the subscribe button and you're good to go. And if you click the little bell icon, then you will be notified of the next video that I release. Anyhow, today is a rather special video. This is the start of something that I've been planning on doing for quite a while. In fact, I kind of thought about doing this at least 2-3 years ago. And I've never been a writer. I've never been one for writing books or putting stuff down on paper. I've tried to keep blogs and I'm just not great at it. So I thought I would do it in video. And what I wanted to do was to try to pull together a history of 1984. Now, for me, that is the greatest year of pop music, and because of this love for that year, and I know I'm not alone in this opinion, I thought I would try and get together a broad overview of what was happening in that year in the world of music. Now, I could do this weekly, and I thought about doing weekly, but then I thought it might get a bit dull if I do it every week, so I'm going to do this pretty much monthly for my kind of main overview. But added into that, I think I will probably do some specific videos about specific things that also happened in the year. Now, what I'm using for research, well, I'm using memory as much as anything else. I've got plenty of old smash hits and record mirrors knocking around. And with other research like old copies of whistle test recordings, listening to off-air recordings of the top 40s, I think I can kind of give a general overview of what was happening in 1984. Now, if we go back a few months, 1983 was a very momentous year. There were lots of big albums, lots of big records. Albums like Seven and the Ragged Tiger by Duran Duran, Thriller by Michael Jackson, which was released in 82, but it kind of dominated 83. There was just so many big albums. True by Spandau Ballet, the Thompson Twins' first album, Quick Step and Sidekicks, and at Christmas you had Paul McCartney's Pipes of Peace at #1, which I think was his last ever #1 single. I'm not too sure. I think it was. Anyway, at the end of that year, Record Mirror did a artist to look out for in 1984, and I thought I would start with just looking at this first. At the end of 1983, here is Record Mirror, and we have the 6 for 84 feature. Now, the first person mentioned is Roddy Frame, he of Aztec Camera. Now, obviously, Aztec Camera did go on to be a big band, but as a solo artist at the time, he never actually became very big. Then you have this guy, Matt Fretton, who actually was on the front cover of Smash Hits. Now, he opened for Depeche Mode in the early 80s, and other than that, he didn't really have much of a career, and sadly, he passed away back in 2013. Now, they also predicted that Jamie from a band called Ellery Bop was going to be the next big thing in 1984, but I do not believe that he ever was. Now, flicking over to the other page, there's a nice little mention here of Tony Fletcher, who ran Jamming magazine. Now, Jamming magazine's actually had a bit of a revival recently because it's been republished as a book, and it's done very well, but unfortunately his pop career didn't take off.
To me, I mean, it's still something important, and if you want to call it a fanzine or magazine, the fact is it's trying to do something good and healthy.
However, we have two other pop stars that didn't quite become massive in 1984, but have been household names for the last 40 years. The first one being Billy Bragg, who we need to give no introduction to. Now, his first album came out in 84, as did his well-known single Between the Wars, but it was much later on that he had much bigger success and now is playing as many gigs now as he ever did then. This, though, would be the biggest surprise of the lot. Yep, that is Lisa Stansfield. Now, obviously, she became a big star at the end of the 80s. However, how Record Mirror picked her up in 84, I'm not sure. But it's a great story that somebody who became so prominent was actually being touted at the time, but didn't quite get known until, as I say, a little bit later. And so, in the end of 1983, nobody could have predicted that the biggest band of 1984 would have been Frankie Goes to Hollywood. In my research, I've made some notes about releases that came out in January 1984, and I've also made some notes about things that were on television and other kind of events at the time. But another good thing about the old Record Mirror is that they listed all the programs about music that were going to be on that week. And that's actually quite fascinating, and we're going to go through some of that a bit later. But let's talk about some of the records that came out in the early month of January 1984. Now, as you can imagine, the week after Christmas, there's not going to be that many new releases. And one of the few kind of releases of note, of which I've got a latter version here, is the Joe Fagan's Auf Wiedersehen Pet theme tune. That's Living Alright. That was released in the first week of January. But as we move into the second week, now we've got actually quite a few sort of fairly big songs got released in that week. The first one was King of Pain by The Police. That was a track from the previous year's album Synchronicity. And then that was followed by Wishful Thinking by China Crisis, which entered the charts at number 36. Now that went on to be one of their biggest numbers. Followed by that, you had Rick Springfield's Human Touch, which entered the charts at 47. Then we had the first of what I would call our classic 1984 tunes, and that's Girls Just Want to Have Fun by Cyndi Lauper, which has been a big tune for the last 40 years. And, you know, you could probably put that in a top 10 of defining pop songs of the 1980s. But then also in the same week, we had the UK release of Holiday by Madonna, and that became her first big hit in the UK. And another song that came out the same week, and this is another song that I suppose people call a one-hit wonder, and that was Feels Like Heaven by Fiction Factory, which for me is another really great song of the 80s. And if you don't know it, the album Throw the Warped Wheel Out is really excellent. And they actually made a follow-up album as well a year later called Another Story, which I don't think's ever been released on CD. But again, very fine collection of well-written songs, so it's definitely worth digging that out if you can. Now, we also have some other singles that came out, not huge songs, but Crime of Passion by Mike Oldfield, which is the first single that he released with the vocalist Barry Palmer. And then Talk Talks It's My Life, again, not a massively high charting single, but it's a song that's grown over the years, and it's now considered one of their classic songs. It's certainly considered the most classic song of kind of their pop era. And then we got three other sort of fairly big tunes. You've got Love Is a Battlefield by Pat Benatar. Then you've got another one-hit wonder, Break My Stride by Matthew Wilder. And then lastly, Dance Hall Days by Wang Chung, which is the first single I think they released after they changed their name, because they were originally called Hang Chung. When it comes to LPs, there was not many new albums in this week, although this one did come out, You and Me Both, which was the second and final album by Yazoo. Not as big selling as the debut Upstairs at Eric's, but nonetheless still an absolutely excellent album. And if we're kind of looking a little bit more sort of on the edge, alternative, Fad Gadget released a single called Collapsing New People, which never became particularly high in the charts, but you know, they are an iconic band that again I think were thought much more of in the later era. And so then we're going to look at the what was kind of else was going around at the time that was on television and radio. So what we'll do is we'll have a little look at a copy of Record Mirror. Now, unfortunately, I don't actually have a copy of Record Mirror for the first week in January, but if we just have a look at the second week, you kind of get an idea. And so on the tube, we've got Duran Duran and some fairly other big names happening in here, like the Cocteau Twins and Death Cult. But then we've got other programmes, like on Whistle Test, for example, Ian Gillan was being interviewed, and The Truth were doing a live session. And then on the sort of weekends kids shows, you can see Leo Sayer was on Saturday Superstore. On the Saturday show, you had Musical Youth and Jim Henson showing his new puppets, the Fraggle Rock. Then we had a repeat of the John and Yoko interview on Radio 1 before they were talking about the the then new Lennon album Milk and Honey, and The Truth were on Sight and Sound in concert, so they got 2 lots on television that week. And then we had the Great Rock and Roll Trivia Quiz on Radio 1, and that's something that you probably wouldn't get on the radio these days. And then also during the week you had Gary Davies was taking over Steve Wright, and on Razzmatazz, which was on ITV, another kids show, you had David Grant and Nick Hayward. So there's a whole bunch of TV programmes that you just would not get on television now. So going back to the next week in 1984, and we had a few more sort of big-ish tracks entering the singles charts. You had Wonderland by Big Country, Here Comes the Rain Again by the Eurythmics, SOS by ABC, and we also had the release of this, which is Hyperactive by Thomas Dolby. Now, in doing some of my research, his probably most well-known song is She Blinded Me with Science. What I didn't realise is it didn't actually chart that high. It only just got into the top 50, whereas Hyperactive got much higher in the charts. And I think it helped because around this time, Thomas Dolby also did a live session for the Old Grey Whistle Test. So I think that kind of helped this record get further up into the charts. Now, if we're looking a little bit more alternative in this week, then Fiat Lux released a single called Secrets. And if you're of a gothic persuasion, you may know the band Incubus Succubus. Well, Tony's first band, The Screaming Dead, they released their cover of Paint It Black by the Rolling Stones in this week. And the band B-Movie released a single called Letter for Afar. Now, as far as albums are concerned, Learning to Crawl by The Pretenders came out this week, as did Life's a Riot by Billy Bragg. But the biggest thing that happened in this week is that on the 13th of January, this got banned. Relax by Frankie Goes to Hollywood. Now, up until the point of this ban, if you like, the single had been out for quite a long time, and it had rolled up and down the charts over, course of quite a long time, and it was slowly getting into the top 10. And then the famous ban, the alleged ban by Mike Reid, made the record go straight into number 1, and it stayed up at number 1 for 5 weeks. Now, this became a massive frenzy because, of course, at the time, people wanted to hear it, but you couldn't hear it on the radio. So people kind of bought the record and then listened to it. And as a kid in the 80s, it kind of felt a little bit naughty if you had something that was banned. And certainly if you look at the cover, I mean, that's not something I would have necessarily wanted my parents to see me walking home from the record shop. But the one interesting thing they did, of course, is they also released it in a plain black sleeve. It's also akin to possibly like a top shelf book, if you like. And my first copy of Relax was the 12-inch single that was in the plain black sleeve, although I did sneak home the 7-inch single first. So I had the 7-inch, then I bought that version of the 12-inch, and then I bought the cassette, and then I bought the 12-inch with the picture cover, and then I eventually found the 16-minute mix as well. So, I bought everything, as did, everyone else, which is why it stayed at number 1 for such a long time. So that was a really important thing that happened. And if we look at what was on the television,
of late, a network called the Cartel has sprung up through the development of around 6 major distribution centres scattered around the country, Rough Trade probably being the best known. It does seem their role in life is to nurture new talent, and in some cases until that heady major deal comes along, and then they're off, mate.
Yeah, I think we had the Cult were on television that week, and the Cocteau Twins, they were both on the Tube, and as well as the stuff on Whistle Test. So, all in all, it's not a bad little week. Now, moving on to the next week, which is the third week of 1984, what did we get? Well, we got The Killing Moon by Echo and the Bunnymen came out that week. Wouldn't It Be Good by Nick Kershaw got re-released in that week, and that became his hit. And a couple of records here that came out in that week. The first one being this Reflex, The Politics of Dancing. Now, this was a minor hit for the band, and it came from an absolutely excellent album, which has recently been released as a 2-CD set, and it's worth pulling that out. If you like bands like, Flock of Seagulls, Duran Duran, that sort of thing. Reflex kind of fit in that mould. And the other record that came out that week was this, which is the third single by the Smiths, What Difference Does It Make? And they actually had two different sleeves. This is the Terence Stamp sleeve, and that's the 7-inch version of it. But there was also this version which had Morrissey on the cover. And I think the idea was, you know, what difference does it make, you know, who's on the cover? And there was always debate and argument at the time as to whether, you know, this one was rarer or this one was rarer. This one, Terence Stamp's a still from a film called The Collector, and he's holding a pint of beer. And in this one, Morrissey's holding a pint of milk. But to be fair, they're kind of as common as each other, really. The 7 inches have the Smiths written on the corner, and the 12-inch doesn't. But absolutely classic Smiths record. And it was certainly my first Smiths record that I ever owned. And so that came out that week. And then there were a couple of other sort of minor records that came out. This one, Street Dance by Break Machine, which kind of was the first hit of the sort of the break dance movement, which kind of didn't go on that long because break dance basically moved into sort of hip hop. But at the time, break dance was a thing, and that was a pretty big record at the time. A song called Eyes in the Night, which was by the Scottish progressive rock band Palace. Again, didn't become a big hit, but over the years, Palace have been, you know, a much loved band in the progressive rock sphere. They never made it as big as Marillion or IQ, but I suppose they probably were about as big as IQ. But, you know, Palace, IQ, Pendragon, 12th Night, these were all what were called neo-prog bands. And as you might imagine, I'm a big fan of all of that stuff. So, you know, that's worth checking out if you want to have a look. Now, what was on television at the time? Well, I made a couple of notes here. The big thing was The Tube on Channel 4 on a Friday night. And this week, whereas the BBC had banned Relax, they showed the Relax video in full. And they also had sessions on there from New Model Army and The Alarm. So, you know, it was a good alternative flavour, but with also the biggest pop band in the world, as it became in 1984. Now, the last week of January, this is where the big stuff happened. There were a lot of absolutely massive tunes released in this week. The first one entered the charts at number 4, and that's Radio Gaga by Queen. And this, I think, really regrew the band's career. I know they talk about how Live Aid made them superstars again, but I think it was this single, because you got to remember, before this album, The Works, came out, they'd done Hot Spaces, and they did a couple of singles that were not really big, particularly one called Body Language, which was kind of like a disco funk thing, and I think they kind of fell out of favour, whereas Radio Gaga is just one of the most iconic songs of the era, particularly obviously the video, and of course that led on to the audience reaction for their Live Aid performance. The next two new singles of that week, one is from the previous year, New Moon on Monday by Duran Duran, but it came out as a single in 1984. And then we had Doctor Doctor by the Thompson Twins, which was their first big single of the year. They'd had Hold Me Now as a big hit, but that came out a few months earlier at the end of 83. And that's a pattern that the Thompson Twins kind of had, where they would bring out one single sort of before the end of the year. In 1982, they brought the single Lies out. And then once we got into 83, then the big numbers came out, like We Are Detective, Love on Your Side, Watching. And then they kind of repeated the same trick at the end of the year. They brought out Hold Me Now, which was a huge song, and then they finished off making their album, and then they brought the rest of the singles out as time went on in the year. Then this came out the same week. This is Rockwell, Somebody's Watching Me. Now, obviously this is most well known, I think, for the fact that Michael Jackson does the backing vocals on it. And Michael Jackson was undoubtedly the big artist of the time. And Thriller, as I said, sold millions and millions of copies through 83. And it carried on selling, you know, truckloads of records. But that was another, I suppose, one-hit wonder from 1984. But again, it's still a song that gets played a lot, particularly at Halloween. Now, there's a couple of other songs here that I just wanted to mention. The first is Run Runaway by Slade, which I kind of think was probably one of their last big tunes. We had My Oh My, which was kind of their big comeback single the previous year. And then they had another single at the end of '84, All Join Hands. But they were both, I suppose you could call them Christmas songs. Even though My Oh My wasn't a Christmas song, it had that feel to it. And All Join Hands was definitely a Christmas song, well, a New Year's song. But Run Run Away, I think, was their last real big sort of rock song. And that came out this week. And another rock song, which again is one of the defining rock songs of the 80s, is Jump by Van Halen. That came out this week, as did their album 1984. And the funny thing with Van Halen is Eddie Van Halen is respected as one of the greatest guitar innovators of all time. But his two most famous riffs are both played on the synthesizer, Jump and Why Can't This Be Love. But Jump, massive song, and I think it's kind of what took Van Halen from arenas to stadiums, certainly in Europe. I think they were still massive in America anyway. But, you know, they were absolutely huge at this point, and they did a massive show up at the Download Festival, or back then it was called Monsters of Rock, but that's regarded as one of their great performances. Now, another one-hit wonder that came out is Matt Bianco's Get Out Your Lazy Beds. Again, if you hear that piano riff and the sort of jazzy harmonies in it, you know, that was a big tune. But the probably the biggest one-hit wonder of this month is Nana's 99 Red Balloons, which also came out in this week even. And again, you know, huge hit, and it's another song that if you were to make any kind of 80s compilation, that would be one song that you definitely put in there. Now, as for albums that had come out, not many had come out. As I mentioned, Van Halen's 1984 came out. The John Lennon Milk and Honey album came out, which was the album that Yoko put together posthumously after John's passing. Most of John's songs were recorded, obviously, before he died. So it wasn't like it was leftovers that they got musicians in. They were mostly completed songs. I think Nobody Told Me, I think, was the single that came out around this time, which is a great song. And then we also had Thriller by Michael Jackson, went back to #1 in this week. I think the success of the Thriller video and the Thriller single, which came out, you know, a few weeks earlier, kind of helped bump the album back to #1 again. As for television, well, there was a couple of interesting things, but I think that the most important thing that happened was the Tube on Channel 4. That had a special which went to the Hacienda in Manchester. And on this special, they had Madonna's first ever UK TV performance, which was, you know, a mime job, but it got Madonna seen by, you know, millions of people. And also Herbie Hancock did a live set on there, because Rocket had obviously been a big hit a few months earlier, and the album had come out, Future Shock, and there was the title track Future Shock also came out as a single, and I think Auto Drive came out as a single a few weeks later as well. But going through that lot then, I would say that January 1984 came onto a flying start, because there were so many classic songs in that month. And hopefully, if you enjoy this video, I will be able to do a roundup of 1984's February work. And anyway, hope you've enjoyed this video. If you have, please like and subscribe, and I'll catch you on the next one.